astronomy. In astronomy, we did a little like preview of this a little bit. Does anyone remember who took astronomy? What the first thing that humanity ever launched into space was? Trent.
A missile.
It was a missile. Yes.
Of course.
It was the V2.
Do you remember the two?
When did it start shooting?
Okay. The V2. We'll talk about the animal space flights in just a little bit.
Is by mistake or intentional?
Sending what?
This is a monkey.
The missile? Okay, so let me preface this. So this is during World War II. All right? This is the V2 rocket. V2. This is the first thing that humanity ever sent into space. And it got into space not as the end goal of its quote-unquote mission, but as just kind of passing through on the way to killing people. Okay? It was, I wouldn't say it was a mistake. It wasn't intentionally sent into space to get to space. It's like how I've been to Kansas, but I wasn't going to Kansas to get to Kansas, because nobody goes to Kansas to get to Kansas. I drove through Kansas. Okay? The V2 rocket drove through space and said hello, and then fell onto London as a ballistic missile. London, the city. Okay? No, but they used, I mean, it wasn't a nuclear warhead, right? It was a traditional, or what we would call a conventional warhead, meaning it used a TNT equivalent, right? The V2 was, it was developed by the Germans, yes, the Nazi. It was developed by Nazi Germany. Okay?
Man, I thought since America was like the one that developed.
So technically, Germany made it to space first.
With an uncrewed missile, right? The engineer behind the V2 was a man by the name of Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun. Okay? Werner was a genius. Okay? Obviously. He was the principal engineer for the Nazi missile program. He was also a captain in the SS.
So a racist.
Probably, but that's true of just about everybody at this time.
What about the Quakers?
Even the Quakers. Most everybody was racist in the 40s.
Not the Quakers.
Not the Quakers.
Not the Quakers.
Okay, we don't know a lot of Werner's political views, nor his social views. He claimed to be apolitical, meaning that he didn't really care about politics and so forth.
I mean, that's kind of more messed up than not.
Yeah.
Oh, they're killing all these people, but it's
Yeah. So this guy, he was an engineer, right? And he just happened to have the unfortunate circumstance of being born in Germany in the late 19-teens. Okay. He became the principal engineer of the missile program that the Nazis were developing in his 20s. He was a genius. Okay. He was a captain in the SS. The SS, if you're not aware, were the elite military the elite military organization of the Nazi Party. Okay. Yeah. So there's definitely some history to it. Okay.
Wait, he was the captain in the SS?
He was a captain in the SS.
And
Yes.
what was the thing that he was the leader of, you said? Sorry.
So the SS, well, he was the chief engineer of the Nazi missile program, right? And the SS was an elite military organization as a part of the Nazi Party. Okay, so that's Werner von Braun. That's WERNHER space VON space BRAUN. Okay, Werner von Braun. Okay. He designed the V2 rocket, which was the first human-made object to make it into space. All right?
There are non-human objects that we didn't.
Yeah, I mean, like chunks of rock, right?
Oh,
That get ejected from asteroid impacts and so forth,
I guess.
right? So this was the first intentionally built and launched rocket that made it into space. All right? Oh boy, abductions, UFOs. Gosh, dang it.
Realize that it needed space to come back right after.
So the rockets that they were testing were missiles, right? So they exploded. So they didn't have the rockets post-launch. But Werner von Braun was captured by the United States of America during an operation called Operation Paperclip,
That's the worst name.
where he and his team fled from Nazi leadership who were informed and ordered to kill him and his team if the Nazis declared defeat. And so right before they did so, Werner and his team knew that the Nazis were about to declare defeat and surrender to the Allies, and so they got the heck out of Dodge. They slipped out from under the noses of their captors. Essentially, they were being held captive in a mansion in Germany, and they slipped away. And yeah. So anyway, that's Operation Paperclip, and they knew that they didn't want to go to the Russians, so they were like, let's go find some Americans because they won't kill us. The Russians wouldn't have killed them either, but the Russians would have made them work in much less enjoyable conditions. Okay, so Werner von Braun and his team of engineers fled to the United States. The United States granted them amnesty from the war crimes that they committed as Nazis. Because why? Because we wanted them to build us rockets. So,
As long as there are.
well, their war crimes were kept. They were kept top secret, classified until after all of the members of Werner von Braun's team died. Werner von Braun had Jewish slaves build his V2 rockets in extremely poor conditions.
Well, they were using slave labor to build rockets.
Yeah.
Like the
Our
pyramids,
rockets,
but
something you need to
H116.
be really precise on.
Well, they did it as an assembly line. The people that were building these rockets only had to do one little tiny piece, like screw in this screw.
If I was one of those, I'd just be like,
That's how
I'm
you
not and then just like mess it up.
Rapey?
Why is it painted like
Ooh, that's an excellent question. Why is it painted like this? The reason why it's painted like this is because the cameras that they were using at the time were extremely low quality, right? But they wanted to get film data that they could review later and see how the rocket was performing. So they painted it in these stripes so they could see all three axes of movement. They could see pitch, yaw, and roll. So if the rocket rolls a certain direction, you'll see the black and white moving on the rocket, pitch and yaw. So these cameras are really bad. So they use these big black and white squares on the rocket to be able to film it and then go back and watch the film and dissect it and look at it frame by frame.
You think if they use like red and blue, then they can hard to distinguish?
Yeah.
Black and white.
Yeah, black and white are much easier to see in black and white film, right? And they're big and with very distinct lines so you can see how the rocket is moving. Good question, Reepi. Or they just could have used, yeah. Those idiots, they didn't use CAD back then? No, okay. All right.
I've always wondered, like, all these people were dying of illnesses. Like, back a long time ago, like, can't use penicillin.
Yeah. All right, this is the first image taken from space. You can see some clouds here. This is the Earth, obviously. This rocket was a V2 that was brought over from Germany by the United States. This was tested in New Mexico, White Sands, New Mexico. And this was the first scientific payload to be launched into space, a camera on a V2 rocket that they were able to recover and get this image from. Cameron? Yeah. Okay. So this is the first image taken by a spacecraft of the Earth. It's a pretty big deal. All right. And I'm guessing that most of you have never seen this image before, mostly because it is an absolutely terrible picture.
Mr. Kershaw.
It is not.
Where's the curve?
Yeah, there's no curve on
It's
it.
right there. Just here.
It's just black.
I don't know about you.
That I'm what? That I'm, yeah, I'm being trolled. Yeah, I know.
No, it's like a traffic switch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
I'm about 90% sure that's the ice one.
So, yeah, images from space from the V2. So this was a huge deal. This was in 1948, so 3 years after World War II ended. Okay, World War II ended in 1945. All right, so Werner von Braun and his team accomplished something pretty incredible. All right, the V2 rocket images. Okay, the Werner von Braun team went on to build the Jupiter C rocket, which was based around, oh boy, do I not have any internet connection right now? If not, that's going to be a problem.
Just yell at it. What's the deal with the internet today, Mr. Kershaw?
What on earth? We have a problem. Oh no. Maybe it's just Ecosia. Yeah, it's just Ecosia. That's weird.
Did the code become like the default browser? Wait, Kershaw,
Huh?
is that code is the default browser?
That's my default browser.
What's my computer like that?
Oh. Oh no.
They should make it the default browser.
I agree.
They should make it the default browser.
All right. So the Jupiter C was a rocket that was designed off of the V2 framework. It used a very similar engine. These are liquid rocket engines, by the way. Liquid rocket engines. Yep, the V2 had a liquid rocket engine as well.
You think it's solid first.
So the first rocket to enter space
Was a liquid, yep, was a liquid rocket engine.
Wait, isn't it solid here?
It's more simple, but when you start scaling it up, things start exploding very easily. So the thing about a liquid rocket engine is you keep your fuel and your oxidizers separate. Okay. Open. So the thing about a liquid rocket engine is you can keep them from exploding because you keep the fuel in one tank and you keep the oxidizer in another tank. With solid rocket fuel, you have a problem with that because it's all mixed together, and so it tends to go kablammy. They just use a single engine on these rockets. Okay.
Were these rockets meant to orbit or just go into space?
That's an excellent question. So the V2 never made it into orbit. These were suborbital launches. So remember what suborbital means. It goes up, it goes into space, and then it comes straight back down because it's not going sideways fast enough. Okay, we'll demonstrate that in a little bit. The Jupiter C was designed to be the first orbital rocket.
The Jupiter C?
The Jupiter C was designed to be the first orbital rocket, which is this guy right here. Okay? And this is the Jupiter C with a payload on top. This is the fairing. This is a two-stage rocket. The second stage is right here. We have a fairing for a payload. It's a very unusual looking fairing, but that's how it worked. Okay? All right. So that was it there in the United States. Over in the Soviet Union, communism, in the Soviet Union, there was a rocket engineer by the name of Sergey Korolev. Sergey Korolev. Okay? Is he a war criminal? Not that we know of. Okay? Much of his life has been shrouded in secrecy because Soviets. Okay? His name is Sergey Korolev. It's S-E-R-G-I-E? No, G-E-I space K-O-R-O-L-E-V. Korolev.
People
Yeah,
were
the
always talking
two
about how they got
S's in
prices.
USSR stand for super secret.
The United Super Secret Revolutionary something. I don't know. Okay, the USSR, they were really secretive about him. In fact, his name was not released until after he died. No one knew who the primary engineer for the Soviet space program was until after his death. Okay? I thought it was Sergey Korolev. Yeah. Sergey. South Carolina. Okay, here in America. Yeah, so Sergey Korolev was the primary engineer behind the Soviet program. And they didn't even mess with suborbital flight. They went straight for orbit.
That's a bad idea.
Okay? They went straight for orbit.
I mean, they had like the highest death rate out of any, like all their rocket scientists had the highest death rate of any rocket scientist.
Yes, we'll talk about their catastrophes.
Did you hear about that one guy that like basically sacrificed his life for his friend?
Yeah, we'll talk about that when we get to human space flight. Sergey Korolev designed a rocket called the R7. Okay, here it is. No. Oh my gosh, my computer's gonna die.
That looks like what somebody would make the first time they played Kerbal Space Program.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much.
That's what the Russians still.
Yeah. So this is the R7 rocket. It is 2.5 stages, all liquid fuel. 2.5 stages. So these things on the side are liquid rocket boosters that come off the side. Okay? So 2.5 stages, so meaning that this is a half stage, the boosters are a half stage, And then there's a first core stage in the middle. And then there's a second stage up here. And then here's the payload fairing. Okay, so remember, first stage, second stage, fairing, payload, right? So the R7 rocket, and yes, Oliver is correct. This design is still used to launch things and people into space.
I can understand things, people.
This was launched for the first time in the 1950s. We are using the same technology that the Russians have been using for 70 years.
I feel like
Dude.
things is trying to, things
Why?
is trying to put on that rocket.
Because the Soviets say, hey man, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It works great. In fact, it works really, really well. Sergey Korolev, between him and Werner von Braun, I think it is a tight race. But I think that Korolev might have actually been the better engineer. Okay? He was a true genius of his time. Okay? So this is the R7 rocket. Does anyone know what the R7 rocket launched into space? A dog, yes, but the first thing was Sputnik. Sputnik. All right. This little orb. Oh, that's the R7. Is it still in orbit? It is not.
Oh, that's a moment.
It is not in orbit anymore. Its orbit decayed. I think that it re-entered in the 1970s.
Wait, orbit decay?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. This is a glorified radio transmitter.
R7 was the first Russian rocket that they beat.
Yep. And
Was this the first thing launched into orbit? Or is it
this is the first thing launched into orbit. Yes, the R7 rocket successfully deployed Sputnik 1 in October of 1957. Okay? October 4th, 1957.
The metal ball.
It was, yes, it was a metal ball with a radio transmitter and 4 radio antennas.
What's in the metal wall?
The radio transmitter.
Oh, how come it was small?
Because spheres are easy to like enclose and make into pressure
They
capsules.
definitely take something on the inside.
They definitely taste, yeah. So,
Okay, so when it decayed, when it's orbital decayed, did it just get burned up in the atmosphere? Did it make it back to Earth?
it just burned up in the atmosphere. Yeah, it's gone,
I heard that.
unfortunately.
That looks like the thing from the Incredibles.
So, yeah, it does look like the Incredibles. Wall-E lied to you. I know, unbelievable. The best Pixar film. I don't know. I don't know if it's the best, but it's really good. I really like it. My wife doesn't like it. Anyway, Wall-E, in the scene when Wall-E is hanging on to the outside of the rocket as Eve is leaving the planet and he wants to stay with his
I mean,
girlfriend,
that was obviously not true.
right? Yeah. Well, I mean, he might be able to do that if he got his little finger metal things wedged into something. Anyway, he gets up into space and he has this thing stuck on his head. When they come out of a cloud of satellites, he has this thing stuck on his head. That thing that is stuck on his head is Sputnik. Okay, so that's a fun little fact for you. But Wall-E lied to you because Sputnik is no longer up there.
Maybe it was a different satellite, you don't know.
No, it was Sputnik. It's very obviously this. I mean, nobody else is going to launch a sphere with 4 radio antennas coming out of it because
Wow.
what is it going to? It did literally nothing.
When you think you're gonna watch a car in the orbit of the
Science project.
It could have been anyway. It could have been a student science project. That's the point. Anyway, so this is Sputnik.
How big was it?
Not very big. Sputnik had a diameter, I believe, of like 40 centimeters. So like that. Okay. The ball itself, and then the antennas were about 1 meter long each, I believe. Okay.
People were scared of that.
And oh, the United States was terrified. The United States population was like, oh my gosh, they're going to drop bombs on us from up there. And that was essentially the whole point of the space
And
race.
they were just playing jazz.
Well, the radio signal that Sputnik transmitted, literally, I can repeat it for you right now. Beep, 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 beep. That was it.
Keep going.
Okay, I just keep on going. The battery ran out after like 3 days, and so it just orbited the Earth, a dead piece of metal.
Wait, so it didn't even have like solar panels?
No, there was no way for it to generate electricity. It had a battery and a radio transmitter, and that was it. Philip?
And I just wasn't thinking about it. Okay.
You're good.
Do they have any pictures that like actually hurt?
Oh,
So this is a twin. This is a clone. They made a few of them. The one that actually got launched, obviously we don't have a real picture of it because it was all super top secret. But yeah, yeah. Philip, no, it wasn't. What's it?
Man, the USSR was so secretive, they kept their beats secret.
Yeah.
they kept it a secret, obviously, for how many years? The fact that the battery died after day 3.
Well, they didn't have to keep that a secret. That the radio transmitter died. Because we here in the United States and all around the world, you could tune in to the frequency that it was broadcasting. So you could tune into it going overhead, and so you'd hear this beep beep beep, and people, if you had good eyes, you could see it going overhead as well.
Wait, was that close to the surface?
Well, you could see it because it would reflect the light from the sun. So before sunrise and after sunset, you can see satellites. If you didn't know that, then you learned something.
Imagine how terrified the United States would have been if like the Russians launched the entire ISS.
The entire space station. The space station is unbelievably bright when it goes overhead, right after sunset, and you can see it go overhead. And if you have really good eyes, you can actually make out a little bit of the shape of it as well. It's really cool. Okay. So originally the Soviets planned on launching a much more complex satellite, but it couldn't fit on the rocket. Somebody was like, oh, I'll just make this a little bit wider so we can fit this on here. No, it didn't fit.
That's not how.
So they were just like, well, we really want to launch something, so let's just make something. So they made Sputnik. Sputnik means simple. Okay? Sputnik means simple.
So America was freaked out over Russia sending something named Simple One.
Yeah.
They like publicly call
Like
it.
a little piece of scrap.
Yeah.
Like, oh, it didn't work. Well, let's just make something. What do you want to make?
So
How big is a beat machine?
this, how about a beat machine? Yeah, exactly.
Like, well, let's see. What do I have?
This here is Explorer 1. Okay? This is Explorer 1. Explorer 1 was the first US satellite. And Explorer 1 launched on the Jupiter Sea.
Oh, that's why that's fun.
Yeah, that's why it has a funky fairing. Okay?
Did this one actually have a way to recharge itself?
It did not have any way to recharge itself. However, this is the first scientific satellite. Okay.
Well, what would you call Sputnik?
Sputnik was just a radio transmitter. We didn't get any data from it. Okay. Explorer 1 actually broadcast some data. And the way that it did that is in the nose here, it had a Geiger counter. It had a way to measure radiation. And it transmitted the Geiger counter beeps through radio waves back to the surface. So we were able to get Geiger counter radiation data from orbit around the Earth. So this was a big deal, okay? Not nearly as big of a deal as Sputnik. There is a lot of radiation in space, actually.
Were we able to tell like where directions were hiding bombs or something? Or was it not that advanced?
No, it wasn't that advanced. It was only able to detect like in its specific area the radiation. Okay, this is Explorer 1. Depending on where you are in space, there's a lot of radiation. In low Earth orbit, so for instance with the space station, they get a little bit more radiation than people on airliners. It's not that big of a difference. But if you get up into what's called the Van Allen belts, which are donuts around the Earth, donuts around the Earth that capture and hold radiation because of the Earth's magnetosphere.
Wait, Van what?
Van Allen, V-A-N space A-L-L-E-N. In fact, the guy that the Van Allen belts are named after he's actually the one that made the Geiger counter that went into Explorer 1. He's a scientist that specialized in radiation. Okay?
Sputnik should have been called feasibility test.
Feasibility test 1. Sputnik. Yeah.
But can we do that then?
So in comparison, the Jupiter C was actually an extremely underpowered rocket. In comparison to the R7, the Jupiter C was a little wimpy, rocket. The R7 is a total Chad. Okay, the R7 has way more thrust, way more capability. All right?
The R7?
The R7 rocket, the Russians.
Oh, yeah.
So I want to show you really quick. Now Soyuz launch. Okay, so the R7 has gone through many iterations. So you might recognize the bottom portion of that rocket. That is the R7 rocket. They've improved the top portion of it, but the capabilities of the R7 are essentially Utah homeowners. If you have a power meter like this, all right. So we're gonna go. So now we use this thing to launch people, and it's really cramped. But so for reference, the Jupiter C had the ability to launch the Explorer 1, which was a tiny satellite, and barely get it into orbit. Okay, the R7 has been the same launch vehicle since the 50s and is able to launch a very large human capsule into space. So there you go, that's the comparison. The Jupiter C is tiny and wimpy, and the R7 can launch an entire space capsule with people. Okay? So these spacesuits are not designed to be radiation shielding. The radiation that you get in low Earth orbit isn't a lot.
But we were going on a spacewalk.
Even on a spacewalk, you know, spacewalks are still in low Earth orbit. You're still within the Earth's magnetosphere. If you get outside of the Earth's magnetosphere, then you're in trouble for long periods of time. Yeah, Eli.
How many years is the R7 now?
The R7 and the Jupiter C were made around the same time. The Jupiter C was based on the V2.
So was it made by two different countries?
Yeah, so the Jupiter C was the United States.
Oh,
The R7 is the Soviet Union.
okay, so the Soviet Union is the child.
Yeah, Soviet Union. We'll talk about the space race in greater detail.
Did this one of the Soviet Union winning the space race for a while?
Yeah. So
We started getting in it later.
we'll talk about the space race. A lot of people talk about the space race here in the United States like we definitively won it. Sure, if you consider the space race to be one long race with one finish line. But I look at the space race more of a decathlon, where there are multiple events that add up to one big thing, okay? So we'll talk about the different accomplishments, okay? So this is the launch of the Soyuz capsule on the modern iteration of the R7, okay?
Who watched this one?
This is this is Russia.
With American personnel.
I believe there's one American astronaut on this mission and 2 Russian cosmonauts. Yeah. A cosmonaut is a Russian astronaut. We use the word astro, which means star. They use the word cosmo, which means space.
That's cool.
I prefer Wanda now to Wanda from Fairly Odd Parents.
All right. So let's watch this really quick. So here we have the first stage burning with the boosters. Okay.
And this is all liquid.
This is all liquid.
They don't even use solid.
They don't use any solids on this.
Explore one was liquid, right?
Explorer 1 was also a liquid. Yep. On the Jupiter C.
The boosters in the middle section, they try and recapture those, or do they just?
Nope. They just let them fall in the Gobi Desert.
Oh, I thought they let them-
Okay. Whoa. Let's go back up here. Okay. So you see this? Okay. That is booster separation. All right. There are 4 boosters. This is called the Korolev cross. The Korolev cross. Okay. You can probably guess why. Okay. The boosters separate, and then the main stage, the first stage, carries on its own. Let's.
Looks like the boosters are wiggling back.
They tumble.
They're probably on the top across the sea.
Imagine they tumbled up into the station.
The Korolev cross is one of the most beautiful things in spaceflight. I'm serious.
Before they're on fuel.
What?
Why would they get them before they're
So they ditch them just barely before they're out of fuel. They shut down the engines and then they ditch them because the fuel lines that run from the boosters into the main first stage actually serve as a propulsion to get them away from. So as the gas is streaming out of them, it pushes them away from the main first stage. So here's launch. So this is an uncrewed launch of an R7 rocket. We call this the Soyuz launcher now, but it is essentially the R7 rebranded.
What's that? That's for that ambulance.
So that is so you can see that there's like smoke or fog coming off of this. That's actually condensation. It's clouds. These are extremely cold. They're using liquid oxygen. Okay? Liquid oxygen is something like -200 degrees Celsius. Okay?
How do they get it done?
A lot of refrigeration. Like
Did they just bring it out?
they use ultra cold freezer refrigerators.
Okay.
Okay? To refrigerate oxygen down to a liquid state. Okay? So it's super cold on the outside. If you went and touched that rocket, your hand would freeze instantly to the rocket.
Have they ever made solid oxygen?
Yeah, we can make solid oxygen. It's like 2 Kelvin. So it's 2 degrees above absolute zero, and it makes a light blue cube.
If you ate solid oxygen, would you be okay?
Would you what? Would you be okay? No.
Like, would you really?
No. The oxygen would try and vaporize extremely fast in your body, and you would explode.
Cool. Someone hold Tris down.
Aiden. No, you wouldn't survive the explosion. Anyway, okay. So here's what's interesting about the R7 rocket, R7/Soyuz. It has a very long launch sequence. They light the engines, so the engines are lit, and then they ramp them up to full thrust, and then they release it. There it goes. I'll provide the sound effects. Okay. I know you all wanted to hear my sound effects today. We're going to skip through this a little bit, get to the Korolev cross. Okay. This is when it's just broken the speed of sound, Mach 1.
Oh, so that's first.
Yep. Yeah, we'll talk about this later. All right, here comes the Korolev cross, right about now. Okay, so let's back this up a little bit. Okay. So that's the fuel. Okay, so they throttle it down. So let's go back here. They throttle down the engines, right? So they cut it off right there, and then when they cut it off, they release the bottom. And on the top, there's actually a ball and socket joint that rotates as it's going up. And then you'll see that when the fuel lines disconnect, you'll see these puffs right there. Okay, so they're puffing out fuel from the top, and that's bringing the boosters away from the first stage, so that it doesn't crash into the first stage.
Has it ever crashed into the first stage?
Yes, it has. So a few years ago, on a human spaceflight launch, Soyuz.
How did they get the boosters to rotate upwards to break out?
The little ball.
No, but they have to get the bottom out.
Okay, so here's the. This is Scott Manley. He's a really smart dude. He's a rocket engineer, and he analyzes stuff for spaceflight. Okay, so you can see here in the video, this is in slow motion. So as the boosters detach, these boosters do what they're supposed to do. They swing away using the fuel lines. This one doesn't, and it falls back in to the first stage and collides with the first stage a little bit lower down.
Did they survive?
They did, because they have a launch termination system that gets them away from the rocket. Okay, so you can see there it collides, and there's an explosion. And then right after that, so it starts to tumble out of control. Right after that, it launches away. So what happens is right here is when the failure happened, right here. And they have a launch abort system that got the capsule away from the rocket before it tumbled out of control. So the astronauts survived.
The mission was just a failure.
The mission was a failure, but the astronauts went back up to the International Space Station like 3 months later on a successful
I
launch.
would not want to go. If that happened to me, I'd be like, I'm
Okay.
not going back up there.
So that's the R7 versus the Jupiter C. Okay? It's the R7 versus the Jupiter C. Sputnik and Explorer, all right, where the first satellites launched. Now we need to talk about non-human but living spaceflight. We need to talk about Sputnik 2. So the United States and the Soviet Union were in a competition to launch things into space. Well, we launched these first satellites, and now the next step was to get a living thing into space.
Doesn't matter.
It depends on what country you're in. If it matters or not is a discussion of if you're Soviet or American. Yeah. Okay. This is Laika.
Well, how did they, if they didn't get it back, did they just send back signals showing that it's still alive when they got into space?
So this is Laika. Yeah. She was a stray dog in Moscow that was adopted by the Soviet space program. And she was trained to live in this capsule called Sputnik 2. Sputnik 2,
Oh,
Laika, L-A-I-K-A. Here is an image of her inside the capsule. Or actually, no, that's just I think that's just a stuffed animal. But that's where she was. So they essentially took Sputnik. So this was essentially the same top as Sputnik, Sputnik 1. And they put a small pressurized chamber underneath it for Laika to live in.
did she live?
She made it to space alive. Yep.
No.
So
Did you make it back alive?
she didn't make it back
Did
at
they-
all.
Did they
Wow.
plant? Did they?
So you're saying there's a chance.
Did they give her any food or?
So she had food.
Did they
on-
plant for her?
Nope.
Oh, no.
It was never in the plan to bring Laika back.
That's so sad.
Okay, I understand that sounds sad.
But everyone that
But here's
Dog kills 30 babies.
but this dog was a stray in the streets of Moscow, nameless. Okay, nameless, homeless. This dog would have died on a cold Moscow winter night, frozen to death. But instead, she's the most important dog of all time.
Instead of frozen to death in space.
Oh, no, I think
No, she actually didn't freeze to death. Nope.
Ran out of oxygen.
That of old age.
She died from heat exhaustion.
That was stress. What the heck? I got real hot there.
The capsule got to about 60 degrees Celsius before she died. Okay?
At least that-
The reason why is because the capsule did not end up separating from the booster, and the radiators that they put on board to keep the spacecraft cool didn't deploy. And when you're in the sun, in space, things get toasty. Okay? Very. Space is quote unquote cold because there's no air, but it's actually really hot because of the radiation from the sun. So it is both hot and cold. Keeping the space station cool is actually hotter than is actually harder, excuse me, than keeping it warm.
You're telling me that the AC constantly?
They have huge radiators on the space station that keep it cool. Okay? 60 degrees Celsius in Fahrenheit, about 150.
Okay, so she basically just got really tired.
Well, she fell asleep before she died, so thankfully. But yeah. Okay? So that's
How
Laika.
long did she last in space?
Few hours.
Yeah.
I think she made 4 orbits.
Oh, 4 orbits.
Yeah. Okay? That's Laika. All right? And Sputnik 2. Now, let me introduce you.
So how did they find out that she died?
Because they had biomedical data coming down from the capsule. They had heart rate, they had body temperature. I think those were the only 2. But heart rate slowed down.
Okay, so basically,
This is Ham.
Is that how they figured out that?
smile.
Wait, what?
Is that how they figured out the capsule didn't separate, or did they figure out?
They figured out that the capsule didn't separate from the booster because the capsule was tumbling in a way that was not consistent with it being alone. Okay, so this is Ham. We love Ham. Ham was the test subject for the Mercury program in the United States. Ham was a chimpanzee that got launched on the Redstone rocket.
I mean, well, when was it invented?
The Redstone?
Yeah.
So the Redstone came to be in the mid-1950s.
Yeah, my book.
The Redstone was originally built as an intercontinental ballistic missile. So was the R7. All of these are ballistic missiles. And they're like, hey, let's show our Cold War rival that we could launch a nuclear payload at your city, but let's just show them by sending something into space. It's very passive aggressive. It's like, oh, look at this cool rocket. It'd be a shame if I happen to take this capsule off of it and put a nuclear warhead on top, huh?
So it's not like that.
Okay, yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah, it's like using an artillery gun to shoot to shoot balloons into the air instead of shooting bullets. Okay, so this is the Redstone. This is the Redstone in its missile configuration. The Redstone is an extended and enlarged version of the Jupiter C. Okay? So we had the V2, and then we used the V2 platform to make the Jupiter C, and then we used the Jupiter C to make it a little bit bigger, a little bit more robust, and made the Redstone. Okay? The Redstone rocket, this is what it looks like in its configuration with a capsule. This is the Mercury capsule. And this is where Ham had his flight. The Redstone was much smaller, again, much smaller than the R7. The Redstone was not capable of achieving orbit with a capsule. Okay? It was not capable of achieving orbit. It just went up and then came back down. Okay?
It'd be funny if you just put a bunch of missiles in the see who gets in. Weird.
So Ham, oh, that's Laika.
So how long was he in space then?
Ham was only in space for 6 minutes,
Did he live?
and he made it back alive.
Monkey superior.
Okay? And he also did not have a name until after he was launched into space and came back alive.
And he just be like, what's his name?
I believe it was chimp number 8 or something like that.
We'll have to check number 1 through 7.
We'll call him.
Okay.
I didn't have
I don't know why they named him Ham, but this was in 1961. Okay. Okay. This is 1961. He had a rough ride, but he was okay. Okay. He made it back alive. The Soviets put Laika into orbit just a few weeks before Ham went up into space.
So they got lucky.
No, I wouldn't say that they got lucky, but they were just a little bit ahead. Okay?
I mean, I don't know if they're lucky if the dog ended up.
Again, they didn't intend on bringing the dog back. That was never part of the plan.
So what was the plan with the dog? Just let it start.
The plan with the dog was to see if a living thing could live in space.
So what was the point of even putting on radio?
So that it could live for a few days.
At least it was painless. I mean, if those things did how much you would die of like dehydration or something.
Yeah.
It would have been way
Yeah,
worse.
she would have run out of oxygen before.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, I heard that like dying of oxygen deprivation would be like the best way to die.
Yeah, because you pass out before.
Yeah. And it kind of just feel like, oh, I'm kind of sleepy.
Yeah, you start feeling sleepy and then you just pass out and then.
Not to be very close.
Okay, so those are the first living things intentionally launched into space. Okay? Ham and Laika. All right? Laika, again, yes, she died in space. Is that sad? Yes.
It's not.
However, again, alternative, freeze to death on the streets of Moscow without a name.
Also, other alternative, she finds a happy family.
She finds a happy family and dies anyway without ever going to space. So I mean, like, I understand that, but she was the first Earthling. She was the first child of Earth.
It was 1961. That was not a bacteria.
To leave, yeah, who was not a bacteria. because they were on Sputnik and Explorer and they made it just fine, right? But she was the first, let's just say, multicellular, right, complex child of Earth that broke the bounds of the atmosphere.
I don't think she knew that, though.
Yeah, I don't think
He probably did.
I don't think she knows.
This is a dog, guys, okay? This is a dog.
If that was that
The consciousness of dogs is like food, pack, alpha.
Wait,
Well, that's why it's cool to start and cook it to death.
Yeah,
Okay,
you know how to-
so,
you know
all right.
how to do a dog that's cooking to death? Food.
Okay. All right, that is the end of the introduction to uncrewed spaceflight for today. Make sure to like and subscribe.